Alrighty, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week 8 of administrative law. We've got three really great grounds of review to talk about tonight. All three of them have an element of, I suppose, statutory interpretation and looking what's implicit within the Act. So thinking about not only what is in the text of the legislation, but what is meant or what's intended by the conferral of power on decision makers as well. So those three grounds of review being statutory purpose, irrelevant considerations, and relevant considerations. So three really useful ones to have in the toolkit, I suppose. Before we get stuck into that, a little bit of housekeeping. Congratulations again, everyone, on getting through the advocacy exercise. I think I said in the post in the weekend and to a lot of people during the week, it's a new sort of assessment. It's something that you guys probably weren't really used to. It might have been your first time doing something like that. And in that context, I was really impressed by the way that everyone approached the task and it was really apparent the amount of effort that had been put in, and that's always really great to see. So well done to you all. Now that you've survived that, we sort of turn our minds to the next few assessment items for the term. So after all your moots, I sort of talked about the group discussion tasks, so I won't belabor that point. The details are up on Moodle, and you're all aware now of what the task is. I will just say a couple of broad points about it. The first is, I suppose, a clarifying point that it's a group discussion, but you complete it individually. So, you're making those posts as an individual, and then you reply to someone else, and that's where the group discussion element comes in. But you're still kind of working by yourself, and you're uploading your submission individually, you're being marked individually. I think sometimes because it's a carryover from the group task, people sometimes think, oh, am I supposed to be submitting this with my partner as well and stuff like that? But no, you do it individually. The group discussion comes from replying to each other in the forums. The other thing I'd emphasize is that it's the goal is to be reflective and constructive, and the best posts, generally speaking, are the ones that pull out some kind of lesson for the future. So, maybe that is something that worked well for you, and you'd like to kind of replicate that in future group tasks. Or maybe it was something that you struggled with or you found difficult, and you know that you want to try and improve on that for next time, and some ideas about how you'll do that. So what the aim with this assessment is to really help clarify and consolidate for you some kind of lesson or something that you can carry forward with you through the rest of your studies. So that's the aim with that assessment. The other bit of assessment is the end of term exam, which is still over a month away, but will be upon us before you realize. So we really are trying to, I suppose, ramp up our exam preparation in this tutorial and coming tutorials. And what I mean by that is I really want to start working with you guys on the kinds of things that you can be doing now that will make your life easier in study week and exam week. And the most useful thing that I think you can do now is try and get your notes in as good a position as possible as we go through. Obviously, you've got other assessment, you've got other things on. Time is a very limited and precious resource. But I guess I say that because this is the most efficient and the best return on investment of your time, is to spend the effort now week by week, just building up those notes so that by the time you get to the end of semester, you've got a really useful set of study notes in front of you. And by useful, what I mean is you're not just, copying the lecture slides or copying the study notes. You've actually got a system of notes that helps you understand and navigate the problems and helps sort of cue you onto, oh, I think this ground of review might be relevant here. Oh, the legislation said if the minister is satisfied, that tells me that it's a non-jurisdictional fact. Though building those types of things into your notes is really important and really useful. The other thing to think about as we build up these notes over the next few weeks is to try and write for yourselves. I call them scripts. I don't know necessarily if that's the best word for them, but the unique benefit for you guys of doing an online take-home exam is that if you're really, really, really prepared, you can have sections of answer prepared, ready to go, that when you open up the exam, you just copy and paste that from your notes into the Word document and edit it to suit the scenario. So, we've already been talking about it for a few weeks. You're going to get a question on, is judicial review available? And within that, there's those elements of what's the jurisdiction, is the issue justiciable, and does the applicant have standing, right? You know that that's coming. And we've already talked through the kinds of things that you need to say in an answer for, is judicial review available, right? You know that you're going to want to talk about the jurisdiction, and you know that it's going to be Commonwealth jurisdiction. So you can have a pre-written section of answer that talks about the Judiciary Act, that talks about the Administrative Decisions Judicial Review Act. And you can spend the time crafting that, editing that, getting the referencing right on that. And then in the exam, all you need to do is just plug that in, tweak it a little bit to suit the scenario, add a little bit to explain how the law applies to the scenario. So, why does the applicant have standing, or the client, why would they have standing? All that sort of stuff you can have pre-done. And then that saves you so much time and mental effort in the exam that you can spend on the harder stuff and the stuff that's going to be a bit more tricky. So the reason I'm flagging that now is that a lot of those scripts are going to write themselves as we talk through them in these tutorials. So if you're prepared and you're paying attention, you can use these tutorials to help you build up those scripts. And so they'll be in your notes. You'll be doing it kind of as you go through the term. And then by the time you get to the exam, you'll have probably a quarter of the exam pre-written already, ready to go. So that's the aim. That's the ideal. Obviously, there's time constraints and people can, you just do as much of it as you can, and you might not get it all done, but the more you can get done, the better. So that's why I sort of tell you now, is so that you can spend this time in the lead up over the next few weeks as effectively and efficiently as possible. In the chat, Carlos asked, will the exam be based on weeks 6 to 12? Theoretically, the exam can cover the entire unit. Given that I've already spent a pretty solid amount of the assessment on merits review and access to information, you can hedge your bets on those not being a major feature of the exam. But the week 2, what is an administrative decision stuff, that carries all the way through the term. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll include, the question will be, is judicial and or merits review available? We had that, I think, last week, and it was, the question was, is merits or judicial review available? And and merits review wasn't available because it didn't quite fall within the section of the act, like, you know, the decision didn't meet the criteria that was set out in the act for merits review. So, you know, that draws on a little bit of the merits review, the knowledge from that week, but not a heap. So theoretically, the exam covers the whole term, but very much a strong emphasis on this second half.
Jacob, you probably haven't written the exam yet, I take it. Is it going to be problem-based like what we've been doing each week in these sessions?
So it will be similar to these tutorials and the midterm, in that it'll just be one scenario that will sort of, you know, have enough substance in it to sustain a good enough discussion. So yeah, it'll be, and I'll put up at least one, maybe two, I'll see how we go, practice exam, like previous year's exam questions as well. So you'll get a sense for the length and the level of detail and that sort of stuff as well. But yeah, so problem based and one scenario that will raise the enough issues for you to talk about in the exam. Any other questions about the exam at this stage? Excellent. So yeah, you know, and we'll have opportunities throughout the next few weeks to have more of a discussion about, I suppose, yeah, some of those more mechanical aspects of the exam. But what I do want you guys to be aware of now is the things that you can be doing and the strategies that you can be implementing as we go through, because that will set you up to be in the best position possible as we go into the exam. So I think that's all I wanted to say at this stage. Yeah, just, you know, making sure that you're prepared. Don't spend these next few weeks just coasting through and assuming, well, it's open book online, I can just look it up on the day. You won't have time to be looking up and researching and teaching yourself this stuff. Obviously, you'll have time to refer to your notes and double check things, but you want to be in a position where you're not reading something for the first time because you think it might be relevant during the exam. Excellent. Alrighty. So with that in mind, let's come through to statutory purpose, irrelevant considerations and relevant considerations. As I said in the intro, 3 really useful and 3 really important grounds of review. And in particular, what we want to be thinking about that's kind of common across these 3 grounds is obviously reading the legislation very closely, but also going a little bit beyond that and thinking about, okay, what's a bit behind this? What can we read into the legislation in terms of, you know, what was the purpose for which the power was granted, and how has that power been exercised? What considerations has the decision maker taken into account or not taken into account? And is it, you know, what can we read into that in terms of, is it implied that there were things that they should have looked at but didn't? Or is, or, you know, what were the things that they looked at that led them astray and completely made the decision problematic? So really kind of putting your critical thinking hat on and thinking a bit more deeply about the legislation and the decision and sort of the process that led up to it. I'll make some other points about the 3 grounds individually as we go through the scenario, but I'll leave it there for now. So our first hypothetical question for this week is a scenario involving the Civil Aviation Act. And in particular, we've got a guy named John, who previously was Chief Operating Officer for Big Cat Airlines, and he did pretty well, but he left because there was a sort of a data breach. And even though it wasn't his fault, he decided he'd had enough. So he established a new little chartered aeroplane business in the Whitsundays, and doing little joy flights around the Whitsundays. And so he applied for an air operator's certificate under the Act. There were a bunch of problems with the decision, or the decision was not to grant him the application, and the decision maker identified what they saw as a range of problems with John as an applicant. And so now it falls to us to consider what John's options are. So let's very briefly think about whether judicial review will be available or not, just to build up that muscle memory and make sure that we're very much in the habit and the routine of thinking about whether judicial review is available or not. What sorts of things come to your mind when I ask if judicial review is available?
Standing and jurisdiction.
Yep.
It's a decision of administrative character. So ADJR section 5, 1A.
Yeah.
And like Luke said, section 8 as well, about jurisdiction of the federal court.
Yep.
The applicant has standing because he's the primary applicant for the certificate.
Okay. And so what can we say about his interests then, given that he's the primary applicant?
Well, his interests have been affected by the decision. Therefore, he has standing.
Yep. And
He's got a commercial interest.
He's got a commercial interest, yes. How would they compare to the average person on the street?
His intellectual, they're more than intellectual or emotional. So.
Yep. He's got a special interest that it's more than merely intellectual or emotional. Yep. And yeah, you guys are absolutely right. It's a commercial interest in terms of thinking about his ability to run this business and generate income from these joy flights. Excellent. So standing, we're happy with. Is it an administrative decision? We've said that it is. How do we know that it is?
It was made by the CASA, being a federal agency.
Okay. Yep. What else?
And it's final. It's a final decision.
Excellent. Is it narrow or broad in application?
It seems quite narrow in application.
Yep, absolutely. It really only affects him. Cool. Yeah, we can go into a bit more detail, but I'm happy to leave that there in terms of it's justiciable. It's a decision of administrative character made under enactment. And then in terms of jurisdiction, noting the ADJR Act and also Section 39B of the Judiciary Act, we'd be looking at federal circuit courts. Excellent. All righty. So we know that he could get judicial review. What types of issues and factors leap out to you as being interesting or useful or relevant from this scenario?
Section 5, subsection 2A, in relation to taking an irrelevant consideration into account in the exercise of power.
Yeah.
That's one of them.
Yep.
Case of that is Klein and Domus.
Excellent.
I thought section C was relevant too because of the purpose.
Yes. Yeah. So thinking about the purpose for which the power was granted. So you're referring to 3A of the Civil Aviation Act, which outlines the main object. Am I understanding that right? Yeah.
That would be my thoughts on that.
Yep. And what else?
The emphasis, that there's an emphasis on preventing aviation accidents and incidents.
Yep. So thinking about the purpose of the act, the purpose is, puts this value on safety and making sure that we can avoid accidents and incidents. Yep.
Failure to consider relevant consideration, just the fact that he's been flying for commercial route for 10 years, and in the decision they said that he had no experience operating airlines.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about relevant
Wasn't it-
considerations, and one
wasn't
of
it-
them being his 10 years of experience. Yep.
And the other thing was in regards to the
Wasn't
fact
it no experience flying Sunday?
Well, so we'll talk through some of the specifics of the experience, but yeah, they took issue with his experience flying planes in the Whitsundays. There's an argument to be made that sure, he hasn't done that, but he's, it's not like he's a complete novice in the airline industry. So yeah, but we'll talk through some of that nuance there.
JP,
Yes.
is there a typo, or have you specifically made the numbers of the hangars different?
I have very much specifically made those numbers different. Yes.
Okay, good. Just checking.
Yeah. No. That's a fair question.
Which I was going to say that irrelevant consideration of aircraft, because it's completely different to a different aircraft.
It's the wrong hangar.
Wrong hangar. Sorry.
Yep. So wrong and well, we'll talk about it in more detail, but correspondingly, they failed to consider a relevant consideration, which is the right hangar. What else?
the other thing was that they deemed that he was responsible for selling the passengers' information with the Big Cat Airlines, but where's the actual proof regarding that?
Mm-hmm.
I would think on that point, though, that let's say he did it, is that really like a part of the act, in that if the act is mainly considered with preventing accidents and incidents, even if he sold every bit of someone's information, that doesn't really impact on accidents and incidents. So I don't really think that would necessarily be a relevant like application of the act.
Yep. So
I think it
we've
could
got
be argued.
Yeah. So thinking about the decision makers focus on the data and the data breach, and then
The impact
following
of the
on
data
from
breach.
that, considering
Like I
whether
could shoot them
that's-
out of the sky because I was annoyed they leaked my data.
And
caused
the
an
reason I
incident.
bring it up is they brought the evidence in. They're making that as one of the reasons for the decision. I think it needs to be addressed to make it dismissed. Like, I think we still need to be putting an argument forward on that.
Yep, absolutely. So thinking about the decision maker, the decision maker has chosen to focus on this data breach as being, it's not really a breach because it seems to have been deliberate, but the selling of the data. Therefore, we also need to think about what the impact that has had on the decision, and whether it's, for one, completely irrelevant, in the sense that it doesn't affect whether it doesn't affect his ability to run the airline safely or not. But then two, this sort of more broad scope thinking about, is the handling of the data at all relevant? So, I think both kind of getting to the issue of an irrelevant consideration, but just sort of picking the level at which that argument is pitched. And the strongest thing is to pitch it at both levels. But we can talk through that in more detail. Yeah. What else?
I think it's also said that currently there's no safe place to store the aircraft. I thought he has a hangar already. He rented one.
Yep.
And he
yep.
has an office space as well.
Yep. So that's sort of touching on that idea that we were talking about earlier in terms of an irrelevant consideration in terms of looking at the wrong hangar and then failure to consider the correct hangar, or the hangar that he has rented out, which, as you say, is probably a very reasonable and safe space to store the planes.
So would you consider that as incorrect finding of information, or you would consider it as irrelevant information?
Well, given, so I suppose we'll talk through in a moment the way that you could sort of structure that argument. But given that the evidence relied upon and the findings of fact note this wrong hangar, you pin it on, they've taken into account an irrelevant consideration, and here it is. Here's this irrelevant consideration, the wrong hangar. And then correspondingly, the relevant consideration is the right hangar, and you provide that number and the details of it that show that it's safe. And the scaffolding again is, it's you focus on the details that have been relied on, and we know that they've been relied on because it's in the reasons for decision. So the statement, you currently have nowhere safe to store the aircraft, ties into the earlier comments about that hangar 5555.
And there's a question mark on the organisation's chain of command is appropriate to ensure that the AOC operations can be conducted and carried out safely, because there's only two employees, the pilot and the mechanic. And there's a question mark on the organisation has suitable procedures and practices to control the organisation and ensure that the AOC operations can be conducted and carried out safely with only two employees. And the safety, the section 28, the financial position of the applicant is one of the matters that CASA may take into account, forming a view of the purposes of paragraph 1A. And it did say that he borrowed just enough money to get started.
Okay, so thinking about maybe his financial situation's a little bit tenuous. Is that where you're going with that one? Okay.
Yeah.
Fair point. Given that it's not raised, I'm trying to remember now. I'm pretty sure it's not raised in the facts or the reasons for decision, I should say. We can probably
only the operation of two people.
Oh, in terms of
that's where Bill's heading, I think.
Not the actual financial status, but the running of two people not being sufficient.
Yes, certainly the personnel angle is in the reasons and needs to be addressed. The financial stuff, I I think if we were advising John, we'd I don't know, maybe we'd tell him to make sure that he's got shores up his lines of credit. But given that it hasn't been explicitly raised as a problem in the reason for decision, I think we could pretty safely leave that one aside for now.
But going back to that section 28 and addressing that issue that Bill has raised, provided that the client can show that he's got an organisation structure for his business, show how he intends to ensure that he's got the safety mechanisms, he's got his logbooks, he's got his checklist, he's got this, that, whatever else he needs from what you need for a flight company. I don't really know what else they need to ensure that safety. If he could show all that he's actually meeting section 28.1 and the things that they've actually identified there that they need to be happy with, would that suffice decision 2B?
Yeah, so certainly, and we'll talk about it in more detail, but certainly we need to address the personnel issue and have a strong defense for why only having the 2 workers is enough. My comments were more on if the financial thing was a concern, it's given that it's not raised in the reasons for decision, we don't have to worry about it too much. And more broadly, the main reason is that because judicial review is so much more narrow in scope and is focused really on those areas of law, but also because ultimately in judicial review compared to merits review, we're not getting a new decision. We're just getting the existing decision set aside and maybe sent back to the original decision maker. We don't have to be as, I suppose, proactive in heading off. So for example, in merits review and in the advocacy task that you guys just did, some people kind of brought up issues that hadn't been raised in the department's initial letter, but they thought on the facts still might have been relevant. But because merits review, you're making the decision fresh, you want to get out ahead of those potential problems so that you can make sure that the tribunal addresses them in the way that you want to. Whereas here with judicial review, more limited in scope, more limited in the remedies that are on offer. Therefore, you don't have to, I suppose, be quite as, you don't have to kind of have that running out ahead of problems so much. But a good pickup nonetheless, good eye for detail. Cool. Anything else leap out to anyone before we sort of think about how we're going to structure this as an answer?
The only other thing that I look at is that section 27 says that an AOC may be issued only to a natural person or to a body having legal personality. So if he has a company, that's his body being a legal entity. So that's all it asks. It doesn't ask for with XYZ members or employees. It just says a natural person. So if a natural person can have a license, then that means 2 people is more than sufficient.
That's an interesting one. I think the issue, I'm just having another reread of the reasons. The concern that they've got is not necessarily you're only they're only 2 people.
Yeah, to
They're
safely
concerned
run
that-
a commercial airline.
Yeah.
But they don't define what's required to run a commercial airline.
And I think staffing is part of the act, isn't it?
So 28(1) B3 refers to the organization having a sufficient number of suitably qualified and competent employees to conduct or carry out the operations safely.
Which would be a pilot and the mechanic. I mean, a secretary is not required to make sure the plane flies correctly. Neither is a booking department.
Well, so here's the thing, right? We're getting into the arguments to put forward in judicial review, right? And yeah, you're very right that the argument that we would be putting forward is that that's only 2 is perfectly fine for this small Joy Flight company. I think in my head I thought you were going down a different tangent, but yeah, you're right. The argument that you're raising is right. Excellent. All righty. Well, I think we've covered all the main ideas and things that we need to be thinking about. Now it's just a matter of harnessing those and then consolidating those into something that's a bit more structured as an answer. So I think, does anyone have a preference of which ground of review we talk about first?
Should we not try and follow the decision makers' steps when referring to the way we do it?
You could, so as in go through the different reasons.
Like we were going to submit them in a submission.
You could.
Apart from the standing, because we all get that whole part, or we should get the whole part by now.
Yep. Yeah. No, I think, well, you raise a good question about structure in the exam more broadly, even though that wasn't your exact question. It's a good point more broadly.
That was my question. It was just hidden.
Perfect. No, there you go. So in the exam, there will be multiple grounds of review that you need to talk about, right? It's worth that what grounds of review might be relevant is worth nearly half the entire exam. So I'm not going to pin that all on one ground of review. You know that there's going to be multiple grounds of review. So there's an open question about how should you structure your answer to that question. Should you go through each ground of review by ground of review, or should you go through it sort of point by point in terms of the reasons for decision and point to all the different problems that or grounds of review that arise for each part of the decision. And I don't necessarily have a strong preference either way. I tend to find that the most common approach is that people will structure by ground of review, and they'll sort of, they'll talk about no evidence, and then within that they'll talk about all the different parts of the decision for which there was no evidence, and then they'll move on to statutory purpose or whatever. That's what most people do. I think it's an easier way of structuring the ideas in your mind and making sure that you haven't missed any grounds of review and that sort of stuff. But I'm not expecting or requiring you to structure an answer in that way. And I often see really, really good and really effective answers. Yeah, they'll raise, the first reason that the decision maker said was blah, and there's a whole host of problems with that. There was no evidence, it was unreasonable, it was blah, blah, blah. Then they move on to the next reason for decision and bring up all the grounds of review that are relevant to that. Again, that can be a really great and really effective way of doing it. Sometimes you end up repeating yourself a little bit in that the grounds of review will cut across multiple reasons. So it's an open, it's up to you which way kind of, and really what my recommendation would be that you do what makes the most sense to you, because that will help you write the clearest answer, which is ultimately what I want to see. So I don't have a preference in terms of an answer, which way you structure it. For the purposes of the tutorial questions, I will break it up by grounds of review rather than by reasons. just because our focus is on understanding those different grounds of review and the different elements of them and the way that they apply. And so I want to make sure that we're really clear on how those elements sort of play out. But in an exam or in your own answer to these hypothetical questions, if you wanted to go, first the decision maker said he's not satisfied that you comply with the safety rules and he's got no experience. Here's all the problems with that. Then they're not satisfied that your organization's good enough. Here's all the problems with that. That's perfectly fine. I'm happy for you to go about it in that way. We just won't do it that way tonight. So with that in mind, we'll save irrelevant considerations for last. And then relevant considerations pairs nicely with it. So we might start with unauthorized purpose. So looking at 5.2c, and we've got when we're thinking about unauthorized purpose, there's two really important questions that we're wanting to ask ourselves. Does anyone have thoughts on what those two questions are?
Is it what was the purpose for which the power was conferred?
Yep.
And what was the purpose for which the power exercised?
Yep, fantastic. So what do we think the purpose was for? Let me try and phrase that better. For what purpose do we think this power was conferred?
For the
To prevent
safety.
accident and incidents.
Yep.
Within
Absolutely.
the aviation area, yeah.
Yep, perfect. So we talked about it before under 3A, Section 3A of the Civil Aviation Act. So the power itself, and it's useful and important to be specific here about what the power is. So the power is to grant or refuse this air operator certificate. And as we've said, the purpose of that power is to promote safety in the airlines. What purpose do you think the power was exercised for?
I think the minister might have focused too much on the fact that there's only two people operating this business, and the fact that he hasn't had a really good, based on a personal, what do you call that? He's called it
On his
not
character.
or something.
Yeah. So the
Bias. I
comments
think she
about
means bias.
But yeah, he's focusing on personal issues more than
so the comments about poor character are
the
a little bit interesting. Yeah, right. There's this sort of, let me get the wording right. You're not a person of good character. Anyone who'd sell passengers' personal information has no business running an airline. It's sort of, the wording is interesting. And so the thing to think about in terms of this question is, for one, to note Municipal Council of Sydney and Campbell, and to think about, if we're thinking about the purpose for which the power is exercised being different from the purpose for which the power is conferred, that's on us to prove, right? The onus is on the applicant or the person alleging that there was some difference in the use of power. And what's difficult at the moment is that there isn't really anything super clear on the fact, right? We've got these kind of suspicions about the decision. For one, just seems really wrong, and for two, the comments in the reasons are, they sort of, and what you might have a suspicion of is that maybe the decision maker was caught up in this data breach, and their personal data was sold, and so now they hate everyone who was associated with Big Cat Airlines or something. There might be that could be what's going on. We don't know, but given that the onus is on us, there's nothing clear enough in the facts to suggest that. What you could do in an answer where there seemed to be something, but there wasn't quite enough, you might, your answer certainly would need to set out the standard of proof, right? It's the onus is on us, and refer to Municipal Council of Sydney, and then talk about maybe what the options are. Maybe we could use an FOI to get the file notes, or some sort of a bit more information about the decision maker, and that might help us prove it. And so at the moment, we probably don't have enough there to clearly say that it was made for an unauthorized purpose. But there's enough that we could be thinking about it as relevant, and we'd have some steps or some options that that you'd talk through and you'd sort of look into moving forward. Talitha, I noticed that you had your hand up before, but I sort of talked over you a bit.
So I was going to ask basically what you just answered. In a situation like this, where like really the only way to prove this point is almost by like skipping forward and talking about the other things. So I was just wondering how you would sort of approach that, but you basically talked about that anyway. So
okay, yeah, no worries. So and sort of thinking generally about the exam, I try and give you more details and more to work with than I do in these tutorials. But if you felt like there was missing information, or there was something more, you talk about it and you talk through. I think in previous tutorials we've talked about discussing ambiguity and working through that in your answer, rather than just ignoring it or focusing only on one side of it or something. Just incorporate it and include it as part of the discussion and analysis. Excellent. So unauthorized purpose could be relevant. We're not quite sure, we need more information, but we've got something to work with and to begin to think about. Excellent. Failure to consider relevant considerations. So 5.2b of the ADJR Act. We've talked about the substance in terms of he has they've said that he doesn't have any experience in the Whitsundays. There's a relevant consideration that has been missed in terms of he's got years of experience as a chief operating officer for a really large airline, during which time they had a perfect safety record. Sure, it wasn't in the Whitsundays, but that experience is pretty relevant to his ability to run an airline safely or not. Similarly, we've talked through some of the issues around the size of the company and whether they have enough personnel. Yes, it's true that there's only 2 people, but there's a relevant consideration, which is the size and the scope of the operations that they're proposing to conduct, right? It's not like they've said, oh yeah, sure, we're going to operate out of 10 different airports and run 300 flights a day, and it'll just be the 2 of us and it'll be fine. They have a small personnel, true, but the scope of the operations is proportionately small, would be the argument. And so the relevant consideration is the scope of the proposed activity that is paired with the size of those personnel. And then lastly, we've also talked about the right hanger, which on the facts of the scenario is perfectly safe and does meet the requirements of the Act. Now, in thinking about relevant considerations more broadly, what what I guys want you guys to be thinking about is Justice Mason's comments in Pecco Wallsend, and in particular, you know, especially where these considerations that you think might be relevant are not listed in the Act. So it's not explicit. You've got to imply it from the scope and the subject matter of the Act. For one, I would be saying, make sure you make reference to Pecco Wallsend to highlight it's not explicit, but implicit in the legislation is a need to consider ABC, whatever they've missed. But going beyond that, and this falls into, I would say, the kind of thing that you can incorporate into your script, just a little paragraph that you can do up, is to think about Justice Mason's cautions in Pecco Wallsend around what's the role of the court in judicial review, and where's that boundary between identifying that the failure to consider relevant matter is an issue with the process by which the decision was made, which is fair game for judicial review. But when does that overextend into telling the decision maker how to make the decision, substituting the court's own decision for that of the decision maker? Where's that line, and where is the court not willing to cross? And so thinking about, you know, it's we think it's relevant, but it's not for the court to say what weight should be given to those factors. Those types of things. You can have a little spiel written up around Justice Mason's cautions. And then that way, if you've got something in the exam that talks about relevant or you think is useful in relation to relevant considerations, you can plug that in, and then that can contribute to your critical analysis and discussion of how the law applies to the facts. Any questions on that one before we move to irrelevant considerations? Perfect. So in terms of irrelevant considerations, the starting point being Justice Stevens' comments in Murphy Oars that, you know, what's an irrelevant consideration? It's all corrupt and entirely personal and whimsical considerations, and you know, pointing to things that are just completely not connected to the core issue or the core substance of the decision. The other thing, and I think it was Bill mentioned it before, really focusing on client and domus and thinking about, is this the dominant reason for the decision, right? And distinguishing between, and you know in the exam that in order to have enough substance to sustain discussion of multiple grounds of review, there's going to be a lot going on. So how do you tell that an irrelevant consideration is the dominant ground of review? What I would say in relation to this scenario is, for one, the kind of the Big Cat data scandal, as we've discussed, seems irrelevant to safety, right? It sure, it wasn't good, but for one, it seems like it wasn't really his fault, and for two, it doesn't really go to the ability for an aircraft to be safe or not. In terms of, was it the dominant reason? When it's buried in amongst all the other problems, it's hard to say really that it's the dominant factor in the decision. But what you can do, and this is why I've saved that one for last, is we've successfully rebutted, or should have successfully rebutted, the other elements of the decision, right? In terms of maybe there's issues around purpose, but certainly there's a host of relevant factors that have been failed to be considered. Once you eliminate those as issues, all that's left is this irrelevant stuff and these irrelevant considerations. And so by that process of elimination, all we're left with is irrelevant factors. And so as a consequence, they become the dominating reasons for the decision, because that's all. Once we've dealt with the other problems, they're the only reasons left on which to base the decision. So that's one way that you can navigate that issue of, sure, it was irrelevant, and for the most part it's pretty easy to establish or to argue that something was irrelevant, but you need to make sure that you go that extra step, talk about client and dominus, and talk about, was it the dominant reason or not? And if it was, great, you argue it. If not, are there kind of other options? Can you be a bit creative and think about, how do we characterize this as the dominant reason? And then similarly, the wrong hanger, looking at the wrong hanger, same thing. It's in terms of the part of the decision, you've got nowhere safe to store the aircraft. That's purely based on looking at the wrong hanger. So that clearly dominates that aspect of the decision. Any questions on that one? Irrelevant considerations.
No, but it now makes sense why you said at the beginning you don't need to always structure your answer in the way the minister or whoever has responded, because after ticking them all off, they're no longer there and we're stuck with this big fat dominant reason.
Yeah. There's this tutorial question is at this point in the semester kind of for that reason. But I suppose the broader thing to think about is in an exam, giving at least some thought to how you're going to structure it, especially because you've only got 4 hours in the exam. The temptation is to just scramble and put whatever you think of first and just go dup, 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 dup. And if that's what you do, that's what you do. But if you're prepared, if you've got good notes, if you've got the scripts that I've been talking about, you will have enough time in the exam to actually take a step back and think about, okay, what's the most logical way of sequencing? Well, for one, discussing the issues in terms of, am I going to go through the reasons for decision, or am I going to go through the grounds of review? But then even following that, in what order am I going to talk about the reasons, or in what order am I going to talk about the different grounds of review? So, there's if you're well prepared, there is enough time to add that, I suppose, next level of thought and clarity to your exam answers. And that's what we're trying to kind of do in these tutorials, is build that up so that by the time you get to the exam, it's you're used to it, and it comes to you without having to expend too much extra effort, I suppose.
Can I ask a silly question on that, Jacob? So are you one
course.
for headings to sort of identify exactly what you're aiming for as well?
Yes,
Like,
please.
so it's
Headings
really
are
set out
amazing.
well.
Yeah. So, and same. So I would signpost it in your discussion, and I mean, the headings make it reasonably clear anyway, but I would signpost in your discussion whether you're going to be talking about the different grounds of review or whether you're going to go through reason by reason. But yeah, headings, subheadings, don't overdo it. I think sometimes people really step out every last little sub element into a new heading, and that, you're just sort of wasting your time formatting at that point. But say you were doing your answer by grounds of review, no evidence, statutory purpose, relevant considerations, those headings. Love it. Love to see it. Any other questions?
Leave you. See you next week.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Any other questions for anyone else?
I've got a quick question about the Pecco case, if I can.
Yes. Yeah.
You talked through the facts of that case, and you said that the mining company had not declared exactly where the deposits were, and that was to their detriment. But then when you considered but then it would seem to be more that there was a new minister that came into power, and that they acted quickly and cleared a whole lot of files through, and that would be more the reason that they didn't consider the mining company's interests. So how was it to their detriment that they didn't disclose the exact location of the deposits?
As in, even if they'd declared the deposits, the minister probably wouldn't have seen it and taken it into account anyway.
Yeah, because the new minister didn't know if the location was accurate or not.
That's a fair question. I suppose my comment was from the perspective of if they didn't include it, then there's absolutely no way it was going to get to the minister. At least if they had included it, then there's a chance that the minister gets to see it, right?
It would have been highlighted. Yeah.
But yeah, fair question. Given that there were issues with the information that the minister was given, would it have made a difference or not? We can live in that counterfactual all day, I suppose. But yeah, that's more where my comments were coming from on that one.
And can you remember the outcome for the First Nations peoples in that case?
Not off the top of my head. I can look it up for you. No, it's
so it would have been
it's not coming to me.
It would have been sent back for a new decision, and I just wonder what the new decision was. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I can't remember. Sorry. Excellent. We'll probably have to leave it there unless there's one final 30-second question. Nope. Excellent. Alrighty. Thanks very much for coming along, everyone. See you next week. Have a good one. Bye.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you for your time.